Be me, name is Beckett. 33 years old, senior backend developer. 7 years at this company. Watched our lead architect walk out. After they told him his technical roadmap mattered less than demographic quotas. In sprint planning. Now the servers are down. The database is corrupted. And nobody left knows how to fix it. This is the story of how identity-based sprint planning destroyed a functional engineering department. How we replaced technical proficiency with demographic ticket allocation and drove out the only person who understood our architecture. How the codebase crumbled under a skeleton crew that wasn't qualified to maintain it. And how no amount of ideology could debug the catastrophic failure that followed. Servers don't care about representation. Databases don't check your demographics. Code either works or it doesn't. We learned this the hard way when the platform crashed. And nobody remaining could bring it back. The company was Nexus Digital Solutions, a mid-sized SaaS platform providing inventory management systems for retail chains. Our software processed millions of transactions daily, tracking stock levels, generating purchase orders, managing supply chain logistics. When our system went down, stores couldn't restock. Warehouses couldn't ship. Revenue stopped flowing. The engineering team was about 35 people, divided into back-end, front-end, infrastructure, QA. The usual structure for a platform this size. Most of us had been there for years. Understood the codebase, the dependencies, the architectural decisions made long ago. That still shaped how everything worked. Mercer was our lead architect, 48 years old with 22 years in software development, 12 of them building and maintaining our specific platform. He had made the original architectural decisions. He knew why every system connected the way it did. He understood the technical debt, the workarounds, the landmines buried in legacy code that nobody should touch without understanding the consequences. His knowledge was irreplaceable, not because he hoarded information, but because the information was too vast, too interconnected, too contextual, to transfer through documentation alone. You had to work alongside him for years to absorb what he understood intuitively about how our platform breathed. Valencia became our new engineering manager 6 months ago. She came from a product management background, had done some coding in boot camp, but her expertise was in process optimization and team dynamics. She had ideas about how engineering should work that didn't quite match how engineering actually worked. Her first initiative was restructuring sprint planning. She said the current system was too hierarchical, with senior engineers controlling ticket allocation in ways that limited opportunities for newer team members. She wanted a more equitable distribution of work that gave everyone exposure to high-impact tasks, regardless of experience level. The concept sounded reasonable in theory. In practice, it meant something else entirely. The new system was called inclusive sprint allocation. Tickets would no longer be assigned based purely on technical expertise or familiarity with specific systems. Instead, allocation would consider demographic representation, ensuring that engineers from underrepresented groups had proportional access to high-visibility, career-advancing work. The problem was immediately obvious to anyone technical. Our platform had components that only certain engineers understood. The payment processing module had been built by Mercer and one other developer who had left 3 years ago. The inventory synchronization system had quirks that Sloan had spent 2 years mastering. The database optimization layer was essentially Mercer's personal creation, assigning tickets to these systems based on demographics, rather than knowledge, meant assigning critical work to people who didn't understand it and couldn't complete it safely, without massive oversight that the system didn't provide. Mercer raised concerns in the first planning meeting under the new system. He pointed to a high-priority ticket involving the payment processing module. Under the old system, he would handle it himself or assign it to someone he had personally trained on that component. Under the new system, the ticket was being assigned to Finley. Finley was 24 years old, 2 years out of boot camp, talented and eager to learn, but had never touched payment processing. Didn't understand the transaction flow, the rollback procedures, the integration points with banking APIs. the security requirements for PCI compliance. Mercer explained this calmly, said he wasn't questioning Finley's potential, just noting that this specific ticket required knowledge Finley didn't have yet, that assigning it to him without mentorship was setting him up to fail, or worse, to introduce bugs. In a system that processed real money, Valencia said Mercer's concerns reflected the exact gatekeeping mentality she was trying to dismantle. She said experienced engineers always found reasons why newer team members weren't ready, that the only way people gained experience was by doing challenging work, that Finley deserved the opportunity to prove himself. Mercer asked who would review Finley's work, who would catch mistakes before they reached production, who would provide the context Finley lacked. Valencia said the team would support each other collaboratively, that the old model of senior oversight was outdated, that peer review would catch any issues. Mercer asked if peers who also lacked the knowledge could catch knowledge-dependent mistakes. The conversation went nowhere. Valencia had decided. Finley got the ticket. Mercer was told his feedback was noted, but not actionable. He returned to his desk and spent the next week doing his own work while watching Finley struggle with concepts that should have been taught over months, not discovered during a sprint. Finley came to Mercer for help constantly, which Mercer provided, despite the system not accounting for this mentorship time. Despite Valencia not acknowledging it was necessary, Mercer essentially did two jobs that sprint, his own tickets plus guiding Finley through his. The ticket took 3 times longer than estimated, and still had issues in code review. The pattern repeated across the team. Sloan was removed from inventory synchronization tickets that she had owned for years to give opportunities to engineers who had never worked on that system. The new assignees took longer, made more mistakes, and frequently came to Sloan for help anyway. Her productivity dropped because she was constantly supporting work she wasn't officially assigned to. Cordelia from HR got involved when Sloan raised concerns. She was told that resistance to inclusive allocation might indicate bias she wasn't aware of, that perhaps she was uncomfortable sharing ownership of systems she had previously controlled, that the new system was designed to prevent exactly this kind of knowledge hoarding. Sloan pointed out that she wasn't hoarding knowledge. She was the only one who had it, because she had spent years acquiring it. And nobody else had put in that time. Knowledge wasn't hoarded. It was earned through experience she had and others didn't. That wasn't gatekeeping, that was reality. The friction escalated over the following months. Sprint velocity dropped by 40% as inexperienced engineers struggled with systems they didn't understand. Bug rates increased as code reviews caught fewer issues because reviewers also lacked context. Technical debt accumulated as quick fixes replaced proper solutions because proper solutions required expertise that had been deliberately sidelined. Mercer documented everything. He sent weekly reports to Valencia and Ashford, our CTO, detailing the accumulating risks. He identified specific tickets that had been misassigned, specific bugs that had resulted, specific architectural decisions being made without understanding their implications. His reports were acknowledged but not acted upon. The confrontation happened in month 4. A critical infrastructure ticket was assigned to an engineer who had joined the company 6 months ago, bypassing Mercer entirely. The ticket involved changes to our database connection pooling, something Mercer had personally architected and that interacted with every system on the platform. Mercer requested a meeting with Valencia and Ashford, presented the risks clearly and specifically, explained that changes to this component, without deep understanding of the dependencies, could bring down the entire platform, that this wasn't about opportunity or inclusion. It was about preventing a catastrophic failure that would hurt everyone, including the new engineer. Valencia said Mercer was catastrophizing, that engineers learned by doing, that his protectiveness of certain systems was exactly the problem they were addressing. Ashford asked if there was a compromise. Valencia said compromises reinforced old patterns. The ticket stood as assigned. Mercer's concerns were officially overruled. Mercer resigned the next morning. His letter was brief and professional. He cited irreconcilable differences in engineering philosophy and wished the team well. He offered to assist with transition if leadership wanted to reconsider their approach. Leadership did not reach out. 22 years of platform knowledge walked out the door that afternoon. In a cardboard box, containing a coffee mug and some books, the accumulated understanding of how everything connected existed now only in fragments, distributed among people who had partial knowledge of systems Mercer understood completely. I felt the absence immediately. Questions I would have asked Mercer now had no good answers. Decisions that required his context were made without it. The architecture that lived in his head was now a black box that we had to reverse engineer from code that he had written years ago. The database connection pooling changes went forward. The engineer assigned to the ticket did their best with limited understanding. The code passed peer review because the reviewers also lacked deep knowledge of the component. The changes were deployed to staging, tested superficially, and scheduled for production deployment. The failure happened at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Production deployment triggered a cascade that nobody had anticipated, because anticipating it required knowledge that no longer existed in the building. Connection pools exhausted within minutes. Database locks accumulated. Queries timed out. The platform went dark. The war room assembled within an hour. Valencia, Ashford, the remaining senior engineers, the infrastructure team, everyone who might be able to help. Monitors displayed error logs scrolling faster than anyone could read. Slack channels exploded with alerts. Customer support was flooded with calls from retail chains whose inventory systems had stopped working. The first question was what had changed. The deployment log showed the connection pooling update. Everyone looked at the engineer who had made it, who looked terrified, because they had done what they were asked to do, without understanding what they were touching, without the oversight that would have caught the flaw. That was now bringing everything down. Rolling back seemed obvious, but the rollback process for this component was something Mercer had documented. Except the documentation was incomplete, because Mercer had planned to finish it before he was overruled and resigned. The partial documentation created confusion about which exact steps to follow. Someone suggested calling Mercer. His phone went to voicemail. Someone found his personal email. He responded briefly that he was no longer an employee and couldn't provide technical support for systems he was no longer responsible for. He suggested they consult his documentation, which everyone knew was incomplete. The outage lasted 11 hours. 11 hours of retail chains unable to process inventory. 11 hours of warehouses unable to ship orders. 11 hours of our platform displaying error messages to every user who tried to log in. 11 hours of our reputation evaporating in real time. The fix eventually came from Sloan, who had worked with Mercer long enough to understand some of his architectural decisions. She reverse-engineered the problem by reading code he had written years ago and guessing at intentions he hadn't documented. The fix worked, but nobody was certain why, because the knowledge to be certain was gone. Whitmore represented a retail chain that had lost significant revenue during the outage. His call to Ashford was not pleasant. He wanted to know what had changed, why the platform had failed, and what would prevent it from happening again. The answers were not satisfying because the real answer was too damning to share. The real answer was that we had removed the person who understood the system, because his concerns about technical risk were interpreted as resistance to inclusion, and now his absence had caused exactly the failure he had predicted. We couldn't say that to a client. So we said something vague about technical issues. Whitmore's company terminated their contract within a month. The outage had exposed vulnerabilities in their supply chain that they couldn't afford to risk again. They migrated to a competitor whose engineering team hadn't recently driven out their lead architect. The post-mortem was brutal. The failure chain was clear. Inexperienced engineer assigned critical system ticket, inadequate review due to lack of expertise, deployment of flawed code, cascade failure, extended outage due to knowledge gaps in recovery procedures. Every step connected to the inclusive allocation policy that had deliberately sidelined technical expertise. Valencia's response to the postmortem was to question whether it was being framed correctly, whether emphasizing technical factors obscured the collaborative successes of the new system, whether the failure was really about allocation or about inadequate documentation processes. She seemed unable to connect her policy to its consequences. Ashford was more pragmatic. He recognized that the outage had damaged the company significantly, that clients were nervous, that the engineering team was demoralized. He quietly suspended the inclusive allocation system pending review. He reached out to Mercer about consulting, received no response. Valencia resigned 2 months after the outage. Her departure statement mentioned wanting to find organizations more committed to transformative change. She seemed to view herself as a visionary whose ideas had been undermined by resistant culture rather than as someone whose policies had caused measurable harm. The engineering team slowly stabilized under a new manager who understood software, who allocated tickets based on expertise, who valued Sloane's knowledge of systems she had built, who wished Mercer was still there to provide the context nobody else had. We recovered functionally, but never fully. The codebase still has areas that only Mercer understood completely. We navigate them carefully, make minimal changes, document what we discover, try to rebuild the knowledge that walked out the door when we told him his roadmap didn't matter. Finley is still on the team, a better engineer now than he was, but he carries guilt about the outage. Even though it wasn't really his fault, he was set up by a system that assigned him work he wasn't ready for. To prove a point about opportunity, that proved something else entirely. I'm still here too, more senior now by default, because the actual seniors left, not because I've reached their level. I understand parts of the system that I learned through crisis, not through proper mentorship. The way knowledge should transfer. The lesson isn't complicated. Sprint planning should be based on who can do the work, not on who should be given opportunity, regardless of readiness. Opportunity matters, but it's built through mentorship, through graduated responsibility, through learning from people who know more, not through assigning critical systems to people who haven't learned yet, and hoping collaboration fills the gap. The servers don't know about inclusion. The database doesn't track demographics. The code either compiles or it doesn't. Either works in production or crashes. You cannot diversity hire your way out of a technical failure. You cannot inclusive allocate around a fundamental knowledge gap. When the expert leaves, the expertise leaves too. Social engineering cannot debug a platform. Political mandates cannot fix corrupted data. Ideological compliance cannot restore service. When the servers are down, only technical competence can bring them back. And if you drove the competence away, you have to live with the silence until you rebuild what you destroyed. If you can. Anyway, that's my story about identity-based sprint planning and senior architect exit, about a code base crumbling under a skeleton crew, about a war room full of people who didn't understand the system they were fixing, because the person who did was told his expertise was gatekeeping, and walked out the door, taking everything he knew with him. The platform runs again. Carefully, cautiously, nervously. We don't touch the parts Mercer built, unless we absolutely have to, because we don't fully understand them. And understanding left when he did, over a disagreement about ticket allocation. That turned out to matter more than anyone in charge believed. Servers don't care about your intentions. They only care about your competence. And if you don't have competence, they'll teach you why you needed it. The hard way. At 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, when everything goes dark and nobody knows how to bring the light back.